June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. 06:30 hours. The ramp of the Higgins boat drops into the surf. For the American soldiers of the 29th Infantry Division, the world instantly dissolves into chaos. Mortar shells are exploding in the water. Men are screaming. But cutting through the low rumble of explosions is a sound that terrifies them more than anything else. It is a high-pitched, metallic buzz. It doesn't sound like a weapon. It sounds like a massive piece of canvas being ripped apart by a giant hand. It is a continuous, seamless roar. There is no gap between the shots. The bullets are hitting the water so fast they create a mist. They are hitting the steel ramp of the boat like a jackhammer. Within seconds, entire squads are cut down before they can step off the ramp. This was the sound of the Maschinengewehr 42, the MG-42. The American GIs called it Hitler's Buzzsaw. The British called it Spandau. The Germans simply called it the Bone Saw. With a rate of fire of 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, it fired twice as fast as the American Browning machine gun and 3 times as fast as the British Bren gun. The human ear could not distinguish individual shots. It was a blur of noise and death. General S.L.A. Marshall, the U.S. Army's chief historian, later wrote, "The sound of the MG-42 had a greater psychological effect on our troops than the actual lethality of the weapon. It paralyzed men with fear. They believed that if they moved, they would be cut in half instantly." This story is not about a tank or a plane. It is about 25 pounds of stamped steel that changed the way infantry fought forever. It is the story of how a company that made car parts and lanterns taught the aristocratic German military how to build the deadliest machine gun in history. It is the story of the MG-42, the first weapon of the industrial age designed not to be beautiful, but to be cheap, ugly, and overwhelmingly lethal. To understand the revolution of the MG-42, we have to look at what came before it, the MG-34. In the 1930s, the German army was proud of the MG-34. It was a masterpiece of engineering. It was the world's first general-purpose machine gun, GPMG. It could be carried by a squad or mounted on a tank, or used as anti-aircraft. But it was built like a Swiss watch. Every part was machined from a solid block of high-quality steel. Skilled gunsmiths spent hours milling the receiver to tolerances of 1,000th of a millimeter. It took 150 hours of labor and 105 pounds of raw steel to build one gun. It was perfect for peacetime. It was a disaster for total war. When the MG-34 encountered the mud of Russia in 1941, it jammed. The tolerances were too tight. The dirt got in, and the precision mechanism froze. Worse, the factories couldn't make them fast enough. The Wehrmacht was expanding, and they needed tens of thousands of machine guns. The craftsmen were too slow. The German High Command issued a challenge to the industry. "We need a gun that works in the mud, shoots faster, and costs half as much." The answer came from an unlikely source. Dr. B. Werner Gruner worked for a company called Grossfuss. Grossfuss didn't make guns. They made sheet metal lanterns, hubcaps, and washing machine parts. Gruner knew nothing about gunsmithing. He didn't know the rules of how a trigger mechanism should look. He looked at the MG-34 and saw waste. "Why are you milling this solid block of steel?" he asked. "Why don't you just stamp it?" Stamping is the process used to make car bodies. You take a thin sheet of steel, put it in a giant press, and bang, you punch it into shape. It takes seconds. It requires no skilled labor. The traditional German gunsmiths were horrified. They called it tinware. They said a machine gun made of stamped sheet metal would shake itself apart. It was cheap. It was ugly. It rattled. But Gruner persisted. He designed the MG-42. Instead of a machined receiver, the body was made of a single piece of stamped steel, folded and spot-welded. The cost dropped from 327 Reichsmarks for the MG-34 to 250 Reichsmarks. The labor time dropped from 150 hours to 75 hours. The Warforge could now produce 2 MG-42s for every one MG-34. But Gruner didn't just make it cheaper, he made it faster. Because the parts were looser and lighter, the roller-locked bolt mechanism could cycle at insane speeds. When they tested the prototype, the rate of fire was so high that the ammunition belt vibrated violently. They had to redesign the feed tray just to keep up with the gun's appetite. The result was a weapon that defied logic. Usually in engineering, you pick two: cheap, reliable, or high performance. The MG-42 was cheaper, more reliable, the loose tolerances allowed mud to fall out, and had higher performance than anything else on the battlefield. When it arrived on the Eastern Front in 1942, the Soviet human waves met a wall of lead. A Soviet infantry charge relied on overwhelming the enemy during the reload pause. With the MG-42, there was no pause. The zipper simply erased squads. However, this speed created a new problem, a problem of heat. Firing at 200 rounds per minute generates enough friction to melt the steel of the barrel in seconds. If the gunner held the trigger down for more than a few bursts, the barrel would glow white-hot and droop, destroying the gun. So, Gruner had to invent one more feature, a feature that would allow the MG-42 to sustain its fire indefinitely, provided the ammunition lasted. He invented the quick-change barrel door, and this simple mechanism would become the nightmare of every Allied soldier who tried to assault a German position. The greatest enemy of the machine gunner is not the opposing infantry, it is friction. When a bullet travels down a rifled barrel at twice the speed of sound, it generates immense heat. In a standard machine gun firing 500 rounds per minute, the steel has time to cool slightly between shots. But the MG-42 defied the thermal limits of metallurgy. Firing at 25 rounds per second, the barrel temperature would skyrocket to 500 degrees Celsius in moments. If the gunner ignored this, the barrel would glow cherry red, the rifling would be stripped away, the bullets would start tumbling wildly, and eventually a round would cook off in the chamber, potentially causing a catastrophic explosion that would kill the crew. The engineers at Grossfuss knew this physics problem could not be solved, so they decided to bypass it. They designed the gun around a ritual that would become the signature move of the Wehrmacht infantryman, the quick-change barrel. On the right side of the gun's shroud, there was a simple, stamped steel lever. When the gunner realized his barrel was overheating, usually after firing 150 rounds in quick bursts, he would yell Laufwechsel, or barrel change. The process was a brutal industrial ballet performed under fire. The gunner would shove the lever forward. The breech would snap open, and the hot barrel would pop out of the side of the gun, sizzling and smoking. It would fall onto the ground or snow. In the same motion, the assistant gunner, number 2, would reach into a carrier case, grab a cold barrel with an asbestos mitt or a rag, or his cap if he had lost the mitt, and shove it into the breech. The gunner would slam the lever shut. Clack. The bolt would fly forward. Bang. The entire process took between 4 and 6 seconds for a trained crew. This speed was terrifying for the Allies. American infantry doctrine was built on the concept of fire and maneuver. In training camps back in Georgia or Texas, GIs were shown films where a narrator confidently explained how to defeat a German machine gun nest. "Wait for the pause," the film said. "The Kraut has to change his barrel. When the shooting stops, you have 10 seconds to rush him." In the reality of combat, this advice got thousands of men killed. 4 seconds is not enough time to stand up, run 10 yards through mud and throw a grenade. By the time an American soldier had lifted his head, the fresh barrel was already locked in, and the zipper was tearing the air apart again. The lull in the fire was a myth. It was a momentary gasp for breath before the scream continued. This weapon dictated the entire structure of the German army. If you look at a US Army squad in 1944, the focus was on the riflemen. 12 men, mostly armed with M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles, supported by one man with a slow-firing bar, Browning automatic rifle. The American doctrine said the riflemen would maneuver and kill the enemy. The German doctrine was the exact opposite. The German squad, the Gruppe, consisted of 10 men built entirely around the MG-42. Ideally, there was one machine gunner, one assistant, and one ammo carrier. The other 6 or 7 men armed with bolt-action Kar-98K rifles were essentially bodyguards and mules. Their primary job wasn't to shoot the enemy, it was to carry ammunition for the machine gun. The appetite of the MG-42 was insatiable. It could consume a standard 50-round belt in 2 seconds. A 250-round box lasted 10 seconds of continuous fire. This meant a German squad had to carry thousands of rounds of heavy 8mm Mauser ammunition just to keep the gun singing for a 10-minute firefight. Every rifleman carried 2 spare belts draped around his neck. If the machine gunner died, the assistant took over immediately. If the assistant died, a rifleman dropped his rifle and manned the gun. As long as the MG-42 was firing, the squad was alive. If the MG-42 went silent, the squad was dead. This centralization of firepower made German small unit tactics incredibly aggressive. A single MG-42, positioned in a stone barn or a hedgerow, could pin down an entire American company of 200 men. The Americans would have to call for mortar support, artillery, or tanks, just to dislodge 2 Germans with a stamped steel gun. The psychological impact of this asymmetry cannot be overstated. An American soldier with an M1 Garand felt powerful. He had 8 shots of semi-automatic fire. But when he heard the brat of the MG-42, he felt insignificant. The sound itself became a weapon of suppression. Veterans described the sound not as individual shots, but as a physical pressure wave that forced you into the dirt. In the Hürtgen forest, the dark, pine-covered hell on the German border, the MG-42 was particularly devastating. The bullets would shred the trees, creating a secondary shower of wood splinters that caused jagged, infected wounds. The high rate of fire meant that if a soldier was hit, he wasn't hit once. He was often hit 3, 4, or 5 times before his body hit the ground. The wounds were catastrophic. Bones weren't just broken, they were pulverized. Yet the weapon had its flaws. The immense consumption of ammunition was a logistical nightmare for a Germany that was running out of brass and lead. In the later years of the war, German commanders often ordered their troops to fire only in short bursts, fire discipline, not to save the barrel, but because the supply trucks couldn't keep up. Additionally, the gun was heavy. Carrying an MG-42, 25 pounds, plus the ammo belts, spare barrels, and a tripod on a retreat through the snow, was exhausting. But no German soldier would willingly trade it. They knew it was the only thing keeping the overwhelming numbers of the Red Army and the Allies at bay. The ultimate testament to the MG-42's design came from the Americans themselves. During the war, the U.S. Ordnance Department was so impressed and terrified by the captured MG-42s that they tried to copy it. They attempted to rechamber a captured MG-42 to fire American .30-06 ammunition. The project was a disaster. The American engineers failed to understand the precise geometry of the roller locking mechanism. Their copy jammed, failed to extract shells, and was wildly inaccurate. They gave up, declaring the German design too temperamental. It was a face-saving lie. The truth was that the Warforge of General Motors and Saginaw steering gear, despite all their prowess, couldn't replicate the genius of Dr. Gruner's stamped steel masterpiece in the middle of a war. They had to stick with their slower, heavier Browning machine guns, while the GIs on the front line continued to pay the price in blood for the technological gap. As the war moved into the ruins of German cities in 1945, the MG-42 found its most terrifying environment. In the rubble of Aachen and Berlin, the long sight lines disappeared. The combat range dropped to 50 meters. Here, the MG-42 was often fired from the hip using a sling, acting like a giant submachine gun. The sheer volume of fire could cut through brick walls and turn furniture into sawdust. It was the last line of defense for a dying regime, a mechanical scream that refused to be silenced until the ammunition finally ran out. While the American GIs in Normandy feared the MG-42 for its sound, the Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front feared it for its range. In the vast, flat steppes of Russia, the war was different. Cover was scarce, the distances were enormous, and the Red Army tactics relied on mass. It was not uncommon for a German defensive position to face a human wave of 500 Soviet infantrymen charging across the snow, shouting "Ura!" In this environment, the MG-42 fired from a simple bipod was not enough. The vibration of 1/200 rounds per minute made long-range accuracy difficult. To turn the bone saw into a precision instrument capable of stopping a battalion at 2,000 meters, the German engineers created an accessory that was arguably as brilliant as the gun itself, the Lafette 42 tripod. To the untrained eye, It looked like a complex tangle of tubular steel and pads. But the Lafette was a masterpiece of mechanical absorption. It weighed 45 pounds, heavier than the gun itself. When the MG-42 was mounted on it, the gun floated on a system of hydraulic buffers and springs. When a round was fired, the gun recoiled backward into the mount, which absorbed the energy, and then pushed the gun forward again just as the next round was fired. This counteracting force meant that even when firing a continuous stream of bullets, the gun sat perfectly still. It did not jump. It did not climb. A gunner could look through the telescopic sight, place the crosshairs on a single window frame a mile away, hold the trigger, and put 50 bullets through that window without the sight moving a millimeter. It transformed a machine gun into a sniper rifle on steroids. On the Eastern Front, this stability allowed for a tactic known as Tiefenfeuer, or depth fire. The Lafette mount had a mechanical searching fire device. The gunner didn't even have to move his hands. He would set the mechanism, and the recoil of the gun would automatically click the elevation gear down a fraction of a millimeter after each burst. The gun would methodically walk the bullets down a predetermined path, sweeping a zone from 2,000 meters down to 500 meters, and then back up again. It was automation applied to killing. A single German gunner could deny an entire square kilometer of terrain. He didn't need to see the individual targets. He just needed to feed the math into the tripod, and the machine did the rest. The optical sight, the MG-40, added another layer of lethality. It was a periscope. The gunner could sit safely below the trench line, with only the small glass head of the periscope and the barrel of the gun exposed to the enemy. While Soviet snipers scanned for helmets, the German machine gunner was effectively invisible, looking through high-quality Zeiss glass that offered 4-power magnification. In the defensive battles of 1943 and 1944, as the Wehrmacht retreated, these tripod-mounted MG-42s became the anchors of the line. They were often set up in interlocking fields of fire. One gun would be positioned to shoot across the front of another gun's position. If the Soviets attacked Gun A, Gun B would tear them apart from the side. This grazing fire, and where bullets fly at knee height across the ground, meant that a soldier couldn't even crawl to safety. The Soviet response to this technological wall was often tragic courage. There are accounts from the Battle of Kursk and the crossing of the Dnieper River, where Red Army commanders, under pressure from Stalin to advance at all costs, sent wave after wave of infantry against dug-in MG-42 positions. The German gunners later described a sickening feeling of fatigue. They didn't feel like warriors. They felt like executioners. They would fire until the barrels glowed white, change the barrel, and fire again. The piles of bodies in front of the positions would eventually grow high enough to block the line of sight, forcing the Germans to pause and move the gun to a different angle. The Warforge of Germany had produced a weapon so efficient that the psychological trauma began to affect the men pulling the trigger, who were sickened by the sheer scale of the carnage they were inflicting with a stamped steel machine. Yet the weapon was not invincible. On the Eastern Front, the cold was a relentless enemy. At -30 degrees Celsius, standard gun oil turned into a glue-like paste. If an inexperienced gunner oiled his MG-42 heavily before a freezing night, he would wake up to find the bolt frozen shut, welding the gun into a useless block of metal. The veterans learned to run the guns dry, stripping away all the oil and using graphite powder or even kerosene to lubricate the moving parts. They also learned to keep the gun warm. It was common practice for a gun crew to take turns sleeping with the bolt assembly inside their coats, against their bodies, to keep the metal warm enough to function when the dawn attack came. Another limitation was ammunition. The Lafette-mounted MG-42 could consume 3,000 rounds in a heavy engagement. That is nearly 200 pounds of brass and lead. The German logistics system, relying on horse-drawn wagons, struggled to keep up. As the war turned against Germany, the fire discipline became stricter. The 1-200 round-per-minute scream was reserved for critical moments. For harassment, they would fire short, controlled bursts. But even a short burst from an MG-42 sounded different from any other weapon on the battlefield. To the Russian conscript lying in the snow, that sound meant that the ground ahead was impassable. The Lafette tripod also allowed the MG-42 to perform a role usually reserved for artillery: indirect fire. Because the tripod had a clinometer, a device to measure angles, a gunner could aim the gun at the sky, using mathematical tables to lob bullets over a hill or a forest, raining them down on top of enemy troops who thought they were safe in cover. It was a capability that neither the American nor the British machine guns possessed. It demonstrated the German philosophy that a machine gun was not just a support weapon, but a complete weapon system, a tool that, when combined with the right mount and optics, could dominate the battlefield in 3 dimensions. As the Red Army pushed closer to the German border, they learned to hate and prioritize the MG-42 crews above all others. If a German machine gunner was captured, he could expect no mercy. The Soviets knew that the man behind that specific gun had likely killed more of their comrades than an entire platoon of riflemen. The Zipper had cut a scar across the population of the Soviet Union that would never heal. But as effective as it was a defensive weapon. It could kill 1,000 men, but it could not stop a T-34 tank, and it could not stop the inevitable collapse of the Reich. By 1943, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department knew they had a problem. Reports coming back from the Tunisian campaign and the invasion of Sicily were consistent and alarming. American infantry squads were being outgunned. The standard American light machine gun, the M1919A4 Browning, was a reliable weapon, essentially a World War I design cooled by air instead of water. But it weighed 31 pounds, fired slowly at 500 rounds per minute, and required a heavy tripod to be effective. The German MG-42 weighed 25 pounds, fired at 1-200 rounds per minute, and could be operated by a single man with a bipod. In a firefight, the Germans could achieve fire superiority almost instantly, pinning down American platoons before the GIs could even set up their heavy weapons. The solution seemed obvious: copy the German gun. Captured MG-42s were crated up and shipped back to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The order was given to the Saginaw Steering Gear Division of General Motors. Reverse engineer this weapon, rechamber it to fire our standard .30-06 ammunition, and get it into production. It was designated the T-24 machine gun. It should have been the weapon that ended the war early. Instead, it became one of the greatest engineering embarrassments of the American war effort. The engineers at Saginaw were brilliant at making car parts, but they fell victim to a fatal mix of arrogance and metric conversion errors. They ignored a critical detail. The American .30-06 cartridge is significantly longer than the German 7.92mm Mauser cartridge. When they redesigned the MG-42 receiver to accept the longer American bullet, they physically lengthened the bolt's travel distance, but they failed to recalculate the complex physics of the roller locking mechanism and the recoil springs. They essentially stretched the gun without adjusting the timing. When the T-24 prototype was finally taken to the range for testing in late 1943, it was a disaster. The gun jammed constantly. The longer American cartridge cases failed to eject properly, getting crushed by the bolt flying forward at blinding speed. Because the timing was off, the gun suffered from bolt bounce. The bolt would bounce back slightly after hitting the chamber face, causing misfires or dangerous out-of-battery detonations. The prototype literally shook itself apart, rather than fixing the math and redesigning the springs, a process that might have taken a few months. The Ordnance Department declared the entire design flawed. In a stunning report, the U.S. evaluators concluded that the MG-42 was unsubstantial and wasteful of ammunition. They argued that a gun firing 200 rounds per minute was actually a disadvantage because it made the weapon inaccurate and hard to control. This was a classic case of sour grapes. Because they couldn't make it work, they decided it wasn't worth working. The project was scrapped. The American infantryman was sent to storm the beaches of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes with the same slow, heavy Browning M1919 his father might have recognized, while the enemy continued to wield the Buzzsaw. To justify this failure, the U.S. Army engaged in a propaganda campaign directed at its own soldiers. Training manuals and films began to describe the MG-42's bark as worse than its bite. They claimed the high rate of fire was a sign of German panic and inaccuracy. "His bark is loud," the pamphlet said, "but he wastes ammo." Veterans knew better. They knew that accuracy didn't matter when a single burst covered a doorway in a literal wall of lead. The suppression effect of the MG-42 was absolute. When a Browning fired, you could peek over a log between shots. When an MG-42 fired, the air above the log was solid death. The disparity in firepower forced American tactics to evolve in brutal ways. Since they couldn't win the machine gun duel, American squads learned to rely heavily on the BAR, Browning automatic rifle. But the BAR was fed by a small 20-round magazine. Against a belt-fed MG-42, it was a toy. So the Americans turned to their own industrial strength, artillery and air power. If a German machine gun nest pinned them down, the GIs wouldn't try to outshoot it with small arms. They would radio for a tank or a mortar barrage or a P-47 Thunderbolt to drop a bomb on it. The American solution to the MG-42 wasn't a better gun, it was high explosives. This technological gap persisted until the very last day of the war. While the German industrial base crumbled, the quality of the MG-42s actually remained high. Grossfuss continued to stamp them out in underground factories. Even in 1945, defended by old men and boys of the Volkssturm, the MG-42 remained the anchor of the defense. A 15-year-old boy with an MG-42 was more dangerous than a squad of seasoned veterans with bolt-action rifles. The tragedy of the T-24 project is emphasized by what happened after the war. When the smoke cleared, American ordnance engineers took a second, humble look at the captured German weapons. They realized that the roller locking mechanism and the stamped steel construction were indeed the future. They admitted quietly that the German concept of the general-purpose machine gun was superior to the American mix of light and heavy specialized guns. This realization would eventually lead to the creation of the M60 machine gun, the famous pig of the Vietnam War. If you look at the M60, you can see the DNA. It took the feed system of the MG-42, the top cover and belt mechanism are almost identical, and combined it with the gas system of another German gun, the FG-42 paratrooper rifle. It took the United States nearly 15 years to successfully copy what a German lantern maker had designed in 1942. The failure to adopt the MG-42 design during the war is often cited by military historians as one of the few areas where the Allied Warforge failed its soldiers. The US had the steel, the factories and the logistics to build millions of American MG-42s. If they had succeeded, the suppression of German defenses in Normandy might have been accomplished with bullets rather than the bodies of GIs. Instead, the Zipper remained the exclusive, terrifying property of the Wehrmacht, a symbol of the lethal efficiency that Nazi Germany could produce, even as its empire collapsed around it. May 1945. The silence fell over Europe. The Wehrmacht was disbanded, its soldiers marched into captivity, and its steel helmets piled into mountains of scrap. The Allies began the process of denazification, erasing the symbols of the regime from the continent. They dynamited the giant swastikas, burned the flags and melted down the Panther tanks. But there was one piece of Nazi hardware that they could not bring themselves to destroy. They respected it too much. In the years following the war, as the Iron Curtain descended and the Cold War began, the newly formed West German army, the Bundeswehr, needed weapons to defend the frontier against the Soviet Union. When the NATO commanders looked for a machine gun design, they didn't look for something new. They looked back at the weapon that had killed so many of their own grandfathers. They simply dusted off the blueprints of the MG-42. The engineers made only one significant change. The original MG-42 fired the 7.92mm Mauser cartridge. The new NATO standard was 7.62. They rechambered the barrel, adjusted the feed tray, and renamed it the MG-3. If you look at a modern Leopard 2 tank today, or a German infantry squad in Afghanistan, you will see it. The MG-3 is virtually identical to the MG-42. It has the same stamped steel body, the same fishtail stock, the same perforated barrel shroud, and crucially, the same terrifying rate of fire. While other nations tried to slow their guns down to save ammunition, the Germans kept the scream. To this day, when a German machine gunner opens fire on a range, the sound is not a tat-tat-tat. It is the tearing of linoleum that echoed across Omaha Beach 80 years ago. It is a ghost that refuses to be exorcised because it is simply too effective to retire. The DNA of the MG-42 is not just found in the German army. It is found in almost every belt-fed machine gun used by the Western world. When the United States finally replaced the aging Browning automatic rifle, they created the M60, known as the Pig. The M60 was a Frankenstein monster. It took the gas system of the German MG-42 paratrooper rifle and mated it with the belt feed mechanism of the MG-42. If you open the top cover of an M60, or its replacement, the M240, you are looking at the mechanical genius of Werner Gruner. The powels, the levers, the way the belt is pulled across the tray, it is all pure MG-42. The Warforge of the 1940s cast a shadow so long that modern soldiers are still fighting in it. Even Hollywood recognized the timeless menace of the weapon. When George Lucas was looking for a heavy blaster for the stormtroopers in Star Wars, he didn't build a futuristic prop from scratch. He took an MG-34 and an MG-42, painted them black, and gave them to the Empire. The silhouette of the gun is so aggressive, so industrial, and so synonymous with overwhelming firepower that it registered as evil to an audience that didn't even know its history. It became the DLT-19 heavy blaster rifle, carrying the terror of World War II into a galaxy far, far away. But the true legacy of the MG-42 is an industrial lesson. Before this gun, weapons were designed by soldiers and built by craftsmen. They were beautiful, polished, and expensive. The MG-42 was designed by an engineer who made washing machines and built by stampers who made hubcaps. It was ugly, crude, and loose. It rattled when you shook it. But it worked. It proved that in the age of industrial warfare, good enough and mass-producible are superior qualities to perfect and precious. The Germans lost the war because they applied this philosophy only to their machine guns, while they continued to over-engineer their tanks and planes. The Allies won because they applied the MG-42's philosophy to everything: ships, tanks, planes, and logistics. The MG-42 was the anomaly in the Nazi arsenal. It was the one time the Germans stopped trying to build a masterpiece and started building a tool. It cost them 250 Reichsmarks, about the price of a good suit, and it killed more Allied soldiers than the billion-mark V-2 rocket program. It remains the benchmark for suppression fire. Every machine gun designed since 1942 has been measured against it, and very few have been found equal. Today, in museums and private collections, you can still find original MG-42s. They are often scarred, the bluing worn off the steel, the wooden stocks chipped. But if you load a belt of ammunition and pull the charging handle, the bolt still slams home with a mechanical authority that commands respect. It is a piece of hateful history, forged by a regime of evil, but as a piece of engineering it is immortal. The bone saw sleeps, but its children are still awake, guarding borders and fighting wars across the globe, singing the same terrible song that was first heard in the snows of Russia and the sands of Tunisia. The zipper is still open,